you should now have your IntuneHRFLow set up on SharePoint and your Power Automate flows. So what I'm going to do here is take you through the scenario, the cycle of all the functionality. The first thing you want to do is go over to the Power Automate flows. In here, you're going to have a number of initial setup flows that you might want to run. Now this is an optional choice, but there's this flow initial setup onboarding, and effectively what this is going to do is synchronize your users from Intune that are already registered back into SharePoint. So let's run this and see what happens. While that's running, let's go over to the SharePoint site here and have a look at onboarding. So you can see that I've now got records on my onboarding list here in SharePoint, and it's telling me that they're synced and they're imported. So we know that when it was done, it's telling us the date, it's giving us details about the users as well. So this isn't optional, right? To just remember that you don't have to do this, but if you do want to have visibility of what's already on Intune, then you need to do this as your first choice, as your first option when you get started. Another task or flow you can run initially is this asset management flow. Now this will run on a daily basis and will update SharePoint accordingly, but it might be something that you run initially before you get going and start adding users. So what we're going to do, we're going to edit this and we're going to go and force a run. As you can see, it's got a reoccurrence there. So let's test this working. You can see at the top there it's telling us that it's run successfully. Now we can go and check that by going back onto our SharePoint site, and I can go into Asset Manager. And you can see that this is populated. It's now populate the 2 devices that I have registered in Intune. So that's worked successfully. So now we've done those 2 tasks, we can start the cycle of creating new users, onboarding, every kind of day updates and tasks, and then go through the offboarding process. So let's take a look at that. Firstly, let's go back over to the home page, because this is our site, right? This is where we can initiate, where you basically, you don't need to go into all the other lists on a daily basis. You can just use these as your task, as your initiation point. And they're also the lists that you would publish out to the intranet, obviously give permissions and lock it down to the relevant people. But I've got the onboarding record here. This is the form. I filled in my first user, picking the details that I need. So Richard Tucker, I've selected a persona, right? I've given it employee number, department, etc. I need to give it the person a start date, so let's do that. And I've selected the manager, right? On the manager, if I just type in a name here, it's going to give me or draw down information from Entra in terms of the users available. I haven't selected Windows 365 or added anything else, and there is this ability to use temporary access pass, right? You might want to use this as part of the onboarding process, which makes it more secure. It's default to no, so you're not going to be doing that. So let's go ahead and submit that. And if we go back onto our SharePoint site now, I can have a look at onboarding, and there's my record. It's a joiner, it's new, so it's now starting that process. But you'll notice that there's certain information missing, and that's because in the background there's a flow that's going to update this. It's going to do some reformatting and auto fill this in, so it makes it easier from the endpoint or the end user's point of view. They don't need to do that themselves. If I refresh this screen, it takes about a minute for that flow to kick in, and then it's automatically corrected and added the relevant information in here. As you can see, there's quite a lot of details for this new joiner. At this point, that's when Power Automate will kick in under the hood, right? And this is where a number of actions are going to take place. The first of which, if we go over to our number 1 flow, because it's going to build up as we go along, let's just find number 1. Okay, so we got this flow. Let's hit the run. If I go over to my email, as part of this flow, there's a workflow built in. So if I select here, I've now received as the manager an approval to approve this new user. I've got the new starter's name details, and it's given me some information about that, that process for onboarding. So I'm going to approve that. And what we should see is this flow should update itself and complete. Let's just refresh the screen to see if it's anything's come back. And there it is, it's succeeded. If I go back onto my SharePoint site, I can now refresh the screen here from the onboarding list, and I can see now that it's been approved. And the good thing is you can track this as well from the workflow tracker. Okay, because there was a workflow sent out, it's giving me the detail of what happened and the status. If I'd have declined that, then this would have had a status of decline, for example, but it's telling me the action, the flow that's taken place, and it's telling me the detail to say, approved new employee onboarding. So I've got that level of information. So let's crack on. Let's go on to our second flow and work through this. Here at the top, we've got an approved onboarder or starter. Now what I want to do is actually go through and create all the Intune records. We want to link into Intune, create the record, set up the license, and make sure that the user is all ready for onboarding. So let's go ahead and run this. And there's that flow, it's run successfully. Now I can confirm that by going into Intune here and into users, and I can see my new Richard Tucker's been added. Okay, let's have a look at some of the details. If I look at the edit, all the details here, it's given the name, first name, display name, we're in the department, what the job title is, we've even assigned a manager, we've got the email address, etc., and our mail nickname. So yes, those details have been updated. Now if I go back into Richard, I can look at the groups that have been assigned. We've got the personas as we picked, and also it's automatically assigned to a license. So if I check the licenses, the licenses have been automatically assigned, which is great. Now going back to groups, these groups might include some Teams groups or SharePoint list groups. They don't at the moment, but basically it will automatically happen in the background without anyone having to do anything. If we check back on our SharePoint site on the onboarding list, there you go, you got the new joiner and the person has been onboarded, which is effectively completing that onboard process. The other point to raise is that if we go back onto the manager's email, it's effectively telling us here, look, onboarding update step 2, Richard Tucker's our new starter, and it's confirming that the process has actually taken place. So even given us the information about getting started email will be sent to new starter 3 days before the start date. So let's move forward and go through to the flow 3 here. I click on the equipment order reminder. So what this is going to do is actually, if we look at the details here, it's going to remind the person that's assigned, the person responsible for ordering the equipment, that they need to go ahead and do that. So let's run this flow. So that flow is run, and you notice that there was another email come in. So let's take a look at that. It's effectively now saying that we need to raise an order. As the person responsible for doing that, it's effectively saying it's time to raise an order. Now if we look back on the flow here with specifics, we're saying get items users with equipment order set to 8 days. Okay, so it's down to the manager. So if the start date is 8 days away, then effectively you're going to get that email. And if I look back on the tracker here and I refresh that, I can see that it's got this workflow raise equipment order. So let's go back on email, let's approve that. We should see the flow will complete, and also our SharePoint list site will update. Let me just refresh that, and there you have it. It's telling us now that step 3 has been completed. If I go back onto the onboarding, There isn't any update specific because the workflow hasn't needed to do that. From this point of view, it's already been onboarded. One more key point I want to raise as part of this particular flow is that it also picks up on the fact that if it's 3 days before the start date of the new joiner, basically it's going to check to make sure that the equipment has been ordered, and then it's going to send out some information. It's going to send out a welcome email to the end user. Okay, so it's going to give them information about the starting process. It's going to give them a link to the SharePoint site, right? The shared SharePoint site where you get information about joining the company, joining the team, communicating, etc. And information about what the manager is going to be carrying out with that new starter. So we're making sure that the end user is catered for here, and it's automating that process, not just for the end user, but also the manager involved. So it simplifies the process. Now you can change this accordingly, change the link to your own SharePoint site, and you might have a general welcome email that you have already that you might prefer to use. And now I want to show you flow 4, which is the onboarding and assigning Windows 365 device to the new starter. Now this is a separate flow. And if you remember, for our new user, Richard Tucker, if we go across the screen, we've got our Windows 365 reason is empty and our setting is set to N. So I'm going to force this, right? Because it's a separate flow and it allows me to do that. So I need to change this field here from N to Y, and I can select a reason, for example, hardware delayed. So we close that should save. And if we go back onto our flow here, we can set this flow running. Let's just force this and hit test flow, test. Now this flow is running, but it won't automatically complete because again, it's got a workflow task set into it or action. So let's head over to our email and we can see we've got another, your approval is required, saying the HR request has been raised for approval for Windows 365. So the user can't be assigned because obviously there are licenses attached to that, and that means money and cost. So we're going to set this to approve, and then we should see the flow complete. And there you have it. Again, if we go back onto our SharePoint site and I have a look at the workflow tracker, I can see we've got a completed approve Windows 365 request. And if I go into the user within Intune, let's have a look at Richard here. I can have a look at the groups that's been assigned, and you can see that he's been assigned to this Win 365 users. Now you will need to have Windows 365 set up already within Intune and basically assigned to this user group to work, but that's part of the initial setup for Intune HR Flow. Now that we've completed the onboarding process, we kind of have a number of flows which look at the asset management. So this is effectively looking at the in-life processes. The first is this asset management, create new or update asset manager. Now we already ran the flow to update our SharePoint with the assets within Intune, and this will run on a daily basis and it will update that asset register within SharePoint. The key thing to notice though is the devices that are registered within SharePoint. Let's take a look. I've added one on the bottom here, the Annie Jones Windows 11, right to the original test that we ran. And this is because basically what will happen every time these group of asset management tasks or Power Automate flows run every day, it's doing a number of housekeeping, including changing the status of these devices. So there's different tasks in here to update the information of the data. There's a task basically that to remove the device and flag that as the status when the device no longer exists on Intune. So collectively it's doing a number of things under the hood. So let's go ahead and run this flow here. Let's go into edit and run it. Hit the test, and there we go. Now that's run successfully. If I go back onto my SharePoint list here, I just want to go and check something first, because one of the key fields is this one here, refresh count. Every time this is run, this will be updated. It will add a number to it. And if there are no new devices, what it will do is effectively refresh this SharePoint list with the details of that device, and it will update that number. So if I go ahead and refresh this now, let's refresh this screen. We can see that there's no obvious changes. So effectively what that's done is just refresh the details. But if I go across the screen again, we have a look at this refresh count. We can see that this last device hasn't been updated, right? So the others have from 3 to 4, but this device hasn't. So effectively means that it should be earmarked for removal, but that isn't part of this particular Power Automate flow. That'll be the next one. Let's head back into the Power Automate flows here and go back onto our next flow, which is flow 6. If I open this flow, this is exactly what's going to happen. So by running this flow, we should see some of those tasks operating and some of the details in SharePoint updated. Let's edit this and then I can run it. So that ran successfully. Let's go back onto SharePoint here. Looking at Asset Manager, there's no obvious changes. And if I go onto my onboarding list, I can look across the screen to have a look at the devices. Now the reason why these haven't updated is because the functionality isn't in this product yet to allow any records that have been imported or synced from Entra from the first instance to be updated, but that will be added at a later date. So this next Power Automate flow is going to address, as we already discussed, this is number 8, assessment management still, records not updated today, set to remove. So we've spoken about this, and this will hopefully set our device to removed as we discussed. So let's run this. It's run successfully. Let's go back over to SharePoint. And we can now see that this device has been removed because it hasn't been updated in the last day. Back over on Power Automate, I just want to show you why I skipped a particular step. And that's because step 7 or Power Automate flow 7 is a weekly device report that gets run. Remember, this is part of the kind of in-life cycle of devices being added, removed, etc. So this is what all the housekeeping is all about. But I'm going to go and quickly run this. Now if I just refresh this screen, there we go, it did run successfully. And what this done, this will generate a report. So let's have a look at one of our managers. We've got a report here, which is a weekly report, right? It's going to give you the details of devices that are enrolled in Intune. It's going to give you a breakdown of the different device types, whether they're compliant or not. So this might be relevant to those people wanting a snapshot of the status of their platform on Intune. We should quickly be able to go through a couple more of these now. We've got, if we look at the flow 9, we've got 9 and we've got 10 down here, both of which are weekly reports. And I've run these just to make it a bit quicker. But if I look over my management or reporting email account, I've got 2 at the top here. One is my licensing report. It's giving me a rundown of my SKUs within Microsoft. You Power Automate there, Teams, for example, Exchange is essential, so it's giving me that rundown. Lots of people actually want this, and I found with customers this is something that they can't discover very easily. So I've created this report to give you that snapshot. And we've also got a rundown of applications. Obviously, knowing what applications are being used out in the field on your devices is key, right? But you can get a snapshot of both the discovered apps, which are basically listed detected applications on devices, or the managed apps, so apps that are being set up within Intune and deployed. Moving back into Power Automate then, we've got from 9.10, we're now moving over to the offboarding. Now, with offboarding, there are a number of tasks. There are a number of things that go on in the background. This is where automation really kicks in. And we need to basically have our resignation letter, etc. that's registered, and we need to have a date approved. And that's when the HR person would basically raise a record. So we create the scenario for that. If we go over to HR, just look on the home site again. Obviously we went through this, but we've got this create a record. Okay, so I can click that. It's going to link into my offboarding list, but essentially I've got a few fields to fill in. We're going to go with our Richard Tucker here, right? This is the one that we actually onboarded. We know that we've got all the license and groups assigned, so this should work. I want to go with an exit date of, say, no, actually we'll go today, right? Because this is important. Let's go to date. You can put details in here, but we do need to add in the user's manager details as well. That's quite important for notifications and reports, etc. So we know that that's Susan. We'll put that in, and that's the completion on is just the day that it's is being completed for reference. So I'm going to submit that. Go back to my SharePoint list and let's have a look at offboarding list we got here. And now we've got this Richard Tucker manager. We've got the details basically, and it's going to go through a number of stages, including the document transfer, email transfer, and basically where the account has been cancelled. So we've got 3 flows that are going to manage this, and it's currently set as pending. So let's go hop into Power Automate. Let's run this flow. Let's test this. Now this flow is running, but what you can see is not completed, and that's because it's got some workflow attached to it. As it says at the top, this is offboarding approval workflow. So let's have a look at our emails again, just to refresh this. And we've got a new email come in. So let's have a look. It's saying basically important, need to review this offboarding request. It's given us the name. It's also asking to schedule exit interview, for example, but we need to approve this as the manager. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll jump back into the flow. That's now run successfully. So if we go back into SharePoint, this is where we're going to get some important information. If I refresh this offboarding record, it's now telling me it's been approved. If I look on the workflow tracker, I've got a new record and it's telling me that it's been complete. And if I go back onto my record that was originally onboarded for this user, you can now see that that person is flagged as a leaver, and also the fact that they have offboarding approval. So there's interweaving between these different lists to keep you updated. That means anyone can kind of track the work that's going on for onboarding and offboarding, and that's what's important to understand where the status is. In terms of offboarding, we've now reached 2 crucial steps in the workflow. We've got this transfer of OneDrive files to manager. This is going to transfer the OneDrive files to SharePoint and give access, and also we've got this disable account and remove from Intune. So there's a lot of steps, a lot of connections that are going on with these. So let's get on with them. Let's have a look at these running. So we hit the run flow and then the done, and that's run successfully. Now remember, this task could take a little bit of time depending on the number of files that are stored within OneDrive, right? But effectively what it's going to do is hook into that user's OneDrive and transfer 2 levels of files into SharePoint. So if I go back onto SharePoint, I can look at the documents, and it's going to create a headline folder for the name of the person, right? And you got this here where you've got the in the root, you've got a couple of documents, and you've also got a couple of documents within one folder. If I bring in the OneDrive account for this particular user, you could see here on my home site, let's just go into the home site, you've got the same documents there, and you got, level 1 is the same documents there. So it's copying those OneDrive files onto SharePoint. And the important thing probably to remember here is that when you do remove the license and the account from the user for OneDrive, you do get up to 93 days, right, before the files will disappear. So you have a period of time to do that, but once that period is gone, you can't gain access. So if it's important to keep access for these users, then this is a process that you can use. Importantly also is that during that flow, the manager was granted access onto the site, onto the IntuneHRFLow site. So if I go to the site, because remember this is a private site originally, but if I go to the site and log on, it should give me access, and it does. So I can then go on to the documents and see the files that have been transferred. The last step here is basically disabling the account, removing the Intune groups, and basically doing a cleanup within Intune for this user and revoking them from access. This is an important step for security purposes, obviously, but also just to make sure that you've got licenses recovered, etc. So let's start this off. So that's run successfully. We can now check and verify some of the scenarios that some of the events that have occurred. So if we look at Richard's account here, let's take a look at the account. We can see that it's been disabled, right? So the user's now locked out. If we look at the groups have gone apart from this dynamic group, which has now gone because the reason for that is because if we look at the details of the user, the department has been changed to null, and we were using the department to dynamically assign to that particular group. So he's got no license. Let's have a look at that. It's got no license, it's got no groups, and the account has been disabled. If we look back over on SharePoint, we can also look at the tracker. Let's have a look at the tracker. We can see that the employee has completed offboarding, right? And that's set to complete. And if we look at offboarding, we can see that the status now of this user is now set to offboarded. So that completes the cycle of the offboarding cycle. There's a lot of actions that are going on in the background. Just to finish up here and show you that there is a final email that goes to the HR person that raised the offboarding record. It's not the manager. The manager's already been informed about the offboarding process, but this basically essentially confirms to that person that the OneDrive files are copied, the steps that have been taken as part of that offboarding process.